When you ask people what they think about the White Album series, you usually get one of two answers, and that is either that A, White Album 1 is pretty bad, or B, that White Album 2 is much better. So needless to say, I went into this with very low expectations, especially considering the fact that this is a visual novel adaptation, and it's also a harem, so you can practically expect for it to be pretty bad. However, it was much to my surprise that what I found wasn't a PG adaptation of a choose-your-own-spunkhole adventure. It was a story that had actually been misunderstood, and even looking back at some of the complaints people had about the story, it was mostly relating to the way that the main character acts, and I gotta say that this guy's a total scumbag and I don't like him either, but we're not supposed to like him in this situation. You know, not all main characters are supposed to be relatable, moral, or likable. More times than not with these harem anime, you're gonna find that the protagonists are basically some sort of self-insert, empty shell of a character for the viewer to vicariously live through the character's escapades with several women, but this isn't the aim of White Album. After completing the series, I think the best mindset to have in order to understand the story is to see this as a deconstruction of the harem subgenre, because if you were to think about what type of protagonist would be able to date all of these women and not have any sort of guilt trip about it because these are all friends and he's dating them secretly, you would always end up with this immoral character who you would trust about as far as you could throw him, and that's exactly who Toya is. He's a slob, he's a liar, and every waking moment is him trying to get one step closer to getting another woman to fall in love with him, and it's easy to see this guy is really hopeless. He has no goals or anything because he's so obsessed with these women. This guy's got a personality disorder. White Album is rightfully set in the 1980s. This was a time when people didn't have cell phones and people didn't have internet, and you would have to think that this would be the perfect time for a man to date 6 women who know of each other without them finding out, because there's not this expectation of keeping a constant strain of communication going like there is nowadays. The story begins with Toya waking up from a dream about his girlfriend, who is an up-and-coming pop idol, and because of this, she has a bit of a busy schedule and can't really pencil in much time to spend with Toya, and you know what they say? When the cat's away, the dog is gonna fuck everybody else. From here on, we're gradually introduced to this ungrateful bastard slew of goddesses, and as you would expect, this being an adaptation of a visual novel, there is the childhood friend, there's the classmate, there's the tsundere, there's the older girl, there's the younger girl, and so on, you name it. I found it pleasantly surprising that these women have both characterization and gradual development throughout the story, and even though each woman doesn't have the same amount of development, this is 24 episodes, and I think they did a lot with the amount of time that they were given. In fact, I felt the majority of these women were detailed enough that their stories would have worked beautifully in a one-on-one romance story. You may notice in many harem series that the protagonist is the only important character and everybody else is either going to be a foil character, just a constant state of fan service, or just some sort of comedic relief. And even when the main character has left the room, he's still the most important character because all of the other women are going to fight over him and they're going to see who can please him the most and see who's going to be the rightful love for him. So even when he's not around, he's still the most important character. But with White Album, thankfully that wasn't the case. It's kind of the exact opposite of that. These women have their own personal lives and even have friendships with some of the other women that have nothing to do with the protagonist. And in fact, many of these women, their interactions and friendships with each other become the catalyst for their own development, even more so than their interaction with Toya. For example, Yuki and Rina wavered in between being friends and rivals as pop idols, and the conflict that they had with each other had little to do with their mutual love interest. It was mostly dealing with the dirty world that is pop music. There's also Hakura and Mizuki, who became acquainted with each other through knowing Toya, and here they spend time with each other, they share the same hobbies, and their friendship grows with each other as they interact and develop that way. I felt that the bond between many of these other characters were much more enjoyable and important to the story than Toya's character himself at many times. There were even a few minor characters that I enjoyed, such as Toya's father, who was just this decent and honest man who had been down the same road as Toya in his path and ended up alone. And there was one scene between the two of them that really stuck with me. This point where Toya needed some money, he needed things to do with these girls, and he couldn't afford it, obviously, because, I mean, dating one girl is expensive. Can you imagine dating 6 at the same time? He calls his father, says he's running a little bit behind on rent and everything, and he needs some money. His father, of course, is barely able to get by on his own, but still manages to get enough food and supplies together, not money, to drop off at Toya's apartment. Toya, to show his angst and gratitude, takes all that and goes back to his father's house, drops it off at the door, doesn't even go and say hi to his dad or anything like that, and that's just the type of guy that we're dealing with here. And my biggest complaint about the story is that he doesn't get run over by a bus in the final episode, because he totally is a piece of shit. The first season of White Album contains Toya getting to know some of these other women and trying to weasel his way into their hearts. We get all of their characterization and a lot of the interaction with each other, as well as Toya himself. I also appreciated that the perspective isn't totally glued on Toya, because we actually get to see a lot of time from the perspective of many of these side characters and minor characters as well, and I really like that, because it's like these characters had lives outside of him and just interacted with each other where he wasn't always a part of that. I also appreciated the fact that we had many of these characters' thoughts written on the screen with different colored fonts, because sometimes characters lie and we get to know exactly what they're lying about and exactly what they mean but just aren't saying. Now, because this is an adaptation of a harem visual novel, you would probably expect there to be a lot of sex, and I'm not sure if there is or not, because there are times when there could have been, like Toya will be with a woman at night and then it'll fade to black, but then again, nobody will act like they just had sex and nobody acts like they had sex with each other. And then the one time where additional detail was given about one of these fadeaways was that Toya was saying that he didn't actually do anything. So even if some of these scenes were replacing some of the moments where they actually had sex in the visual novel, it doesn't mean anything to the story of the anime, because the viewers can't be expected to know that. We need to have a bit more hints to it, or not necessarily see it, but we just need to know that some of it happens. And that's really one of my bigger complaints about the story itself. Of course, aside from Toya not getting hit by a bus in the final episode, but just the fact that Toya isn't out having sex with all of these women, because you would imagine that White Album is the type of story that's trying to take this whole harem subgenre seriously, and you just don't have a dude that dates 6 different women at the same time and doesn't have sex with them. That's a lot of trouble to go through, and he's, not really getting a whole lot. He's just putting himself through a lot of stress, spending a lot of money, and you would expect for a guy to date 6 different women, he would probably want to have sex with them. As far as the ending is concerned, this is another area where its roots hinder its narrative, because it's very vague, it's left open to interpretation. However, it's not totally bad, because what exactly happens was kind of foreshadowed through dialogue earlier on in the series with a few other characters. Don't want to say too much, because that might give something away, but it's something that is open to interpretation. It's not completely bad, but it definitely did miss the mark. My final score for White Album is a 7.6 out of 10, and what hurt this the most was the protagonist. Not because he was a jerk, granted, that did hurt some people's enjoyment factor. I know that for sure, because I didn't enjoy watching him unless he got hit by a bus in some other alternate ending. I played the visual novel for that, though. But he was a character that just didn't fulfill his character's potential. He had experiences that he didn't learn anything from. There were plenty of times when he should have developed, but just didn't. I think the type of people who would appreciate White Album the most would be the people who are able to watch a story with a protagonist that they either can't relate with or just don't like, and appreciate it for the type of story that's being told, even though it is not perfect. I wanted to give a special thanks to Ivan for requesting this video on Patreon, and also for his patience with that as well, well, because it took me quite a while to do this. I've been having a lot of things going on lately. I'm sure a lot of you guys can realize, like, I didn't upload that many videos as I used to. There's a lot of stuff going on here, but big thanks to Ivan for requesting this video on Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and also hit that like button, and stay tuned next time, because I've got a bunch of seasonal anime review from winter, and sometime in there I'm going to review Bamboo Blade as well. I'll see you then.